There are limits to our analog representations and evidence for more propositional representations or propositional coding. For example, if you were to find hidden shapes in a mental image, you can do that pretty well on a physical image you're looking at. It's like find all the triangles in this image or something like that, or look at some kind of shape and determine what other smaller shapes make it up. But if you have this image only in your imagination, in your mind's eye, you actually may not be able to answer that question. We struggle to find hidden figures in images that we are only imagining and not actually perceiving. And so because of that, that's some evidence that there are some analog components to our mental images, but maybe some propositional coding. We're not imagining it exactly like it exists in the real world. We're imagining kind of our interpretation of it. And our original interpretation of it, when we looked at the original image and then looked away, probably did not include the hidden figures until we were asked about them. We can also mentally rotate two-dimensional and three-dimensional objects, and we do that in an analog format, meaning that instead of just when you rotate an image, instead of it starting at the original position and then it just immediately snaps to 90 degrees with nothing in between, we actually rotate it the entire degrees in between. It's almost like we're turning it around with our hand. That's what we're doing in our mind. So in these panels, what you're seeing on the left is a sample image, and then the probe image on the right is where we would ask participants, is the image on the right the same shape as the one on the left? And so you have to mentally rotate the one on the right to try to see if it matches up and actually is the same shape as the one on the left. Some of them are not. It takes you longer to do this if the shape on the right is like turned or rotated even further, right? So you have to rotate it further in your mind, and that's going to take you longer to rotate it and then answer the question. So this is one situation where response latency, like a lot of the other research we've just looked at, is an incredibly useful tool that lets us infer quite a lot about what's going on underneath the surface in somebody's mind. But the symbolic distance effect is another example of analog codes. So if I'm asking you to judge whether something is more than another one or larger than some other value, if the gap between the two things is bigger, you answer that question faster. That is the symbolic distance effect, which means that there's some relationship between the physical properties of those items and your manipulation of them to answer questions. So it's like you are answering the question as if these were images of objects in the real world, and your answer is proportional to the difference between them. Now, even for people without vision, they also use analog codes for comparisons, mental rotations, navigation. All of that research we just talked about also applies to blind people, but they use haptic and tactile information instead. So you could ask them to study raised maps of the same information, and they're going to show the same relationships, that showing that they are probably using analog codes. Now, one evidence that we might use dual codes, meaning that some concepts for us have both propositional and analog representations in our minds, is the process of semantic satiation, which is where you say a word over and over and over until it doesn't really sound like a word anymore. Have you ever done that? Your textbook talks about how this happens more to children than adults. We kind of lose this as we age, but it does still happen to me sometimes for sure. But interestingly, like your textbook uses the example of if you said the word chalk over and over and over, if you say it about 6 times or more, you start to go, it just sounds like a meaningless sound. How is that a word? And then you can still see like the image of chalk though, and like the sort of like smell of chalk dust in the air and in the feeling of it on your hands. So you still have the analog codes of what it looks like, feels like, smells like, what it sounds like, maybe to, hit the erasers together to clean them out if you ever had to do that and you went to school with where they still had chalkboards. But the propositional code is more of the word tied to its meaning. And so when you repeat the word over and over and get this situation of semantic satiation, it's almost like you have removed temporarily that propositional code. You have removed that word's connection to its abstract meaning, but the word is still connected to its very grounded, embodied meaning of what it feels like to interact with that thing. So the dual code hypothesis says some concepts are stored with both analog and propositional codes, so that one can be kind of a backup for the other one. All words have some amount of imagery value, so some of them are some that you can very easily and strongly make mental images of. Others are more abstract concepts that don't really have like a picture associated with them. So researchers gathered a whole bunch of words and had participants rate the strength of the imagery value, like how strong of a mental image do you have for this word. And then future researchers used this same list and database of words to do imagery research. And they found that words that have a higher imagery value that those previous people had rated that they could more easily make a mental image of are words that we can remember more easily. So normally we have what's called a picture superiority effect, meaning that those analog codes of the picture are easier for us to remember than the abstract propositional codes. But there is an exception, which we're about to look at. This is when we're trying to test the dual code hypothesis and see if we could separate the propositional and analog codes from a concept and see which ones people remember better. So they gave people abstract shapes, and for some of them, they gave them a description of it. So for half of these participants, they told them to just try to remember the shape, like try to draw it back later. For the other half of participants, they asked them to come up with a description of what's happening in the picture, or sometimes in other studies, they gave them like a name of what the picture is. And then they found when they tested people on their recognition and their recall ability to draw these images later, the people who had a propositional code attached to this little droodle or kind of doodle, were able to remember it better. The people who just saw the shapes, which should be only an analog representation, right? You should see just like a mental image of what the shape is, didn't actually remember it as well. The people who got the propositional representation, the verbal description along with it, remembered the images better. They were able to draw them back and able to pick them out and say, yes, I've seen that one. No, I haven't seen that one. Because that propositional description served as like a reinforcement of the picture. So the embodied or analog representation by itself was not enough. It helps to give it some kind of context. Why would I need to remember this? What does it mean? What is it? People have individual differences in imagery ability, though. I've kind of been talking as if everybody uses representations in a similar way, and that's not really true. People range from having mental images that are so strong they're just like perceiving, like no detail loss, to people who have aphantasia, which is having no mental image at all. Most of us have somewhere in the middle where our mental images are pretty good, and we can often mix up whether we saw or read something. People with vivid imagery tend to make more mistakes about whether they saw or read something. So if you have read a book that's also been made into a movie or a TV show, and you have strong mental imagery, you might mix up what scenes happened only in the books versus actually in the show. So let's say you've seen The Witcher and you've been reading some of the Witcher books, but you have some of those scenes imagined so well from the books that you don't know whether they happened in the show or not. You kind of remember them as happening in the show, but you might have imagined that so well that it crept into your memory as if you had actually seen it visually before. Some cultures, like the Inuit, have better visuospatial imagery ability compared to other people, and that could just be because they spend so much time outdoors and they have a strong culture of hunting and navigation in a place that does not have a lot of landmarks, not trees and that kind of stuff. Some people, like I said, though, have almost no imagery ability. Aphantasia has not been studied very much. It's kind of a newly understood phenomenon that some people do not have a mental image or a mind's eye. So we're not sure exactly why that is or what all of its effects are just yet. It's just kind of a difference in brain wiring, it seems like. People also can be kind of primarily visualizers or verbalizers in the way that they describe the world. I feel like I'm a strong mixture of both, but I've never done any tasks to really test those to be sure. Visualizers tend to be better at math, but not all of them. It turns out there's actually two kinds of visualizers. So visualizers compared to verbalizers are more likely to be able to use images to solve math problems, but only like half of the visualizers. Because some visualizers are really good at picturing an image, but they're not as good at manipulating spatial information. Other visualizers, on the other hand, and this is the one I know I definitely don't do well, they're able to kind of represent size and distance and movement and stuff like that in their minds very well, and that helps them solve math and physics problems. So people with high spatial ability are best at navigating in large-scale environments, and they also are really good at solving mechanical type problems where they have to make things move in their mind and kind of watch what the outcome is going to be.